Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Poisoned. Letter Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. A thick fog clung to the streets of London, curling around the gas lamps like spectral fingers. It was a night of peculiar stillness, broken only by the distant clip-clop of hooves and the occasional murmur of voices lost in the mist. In the sanctuary of 201B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his lean figure illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire. He was deep in thought, a thin spiral of smoke rising from his pipe, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as though he could discern mysteries within its plastered surface. Dr. John Watson, having returned from an evening visit to his patients, settled into his usual chair opposite Holmes. He was about to remark on the unusually quiet evening when a sharp rap at the door interrupted the stillness. Mrs. Hudson, ever the vigilant housekeeper, entered with a grave expression. "A visitor, Mr. Holmes. He insists it is a matter of urgency." Holmes gestured for her to show the guest in. Moments later, a man stepped into the room, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting about with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in an expensive but slightly dishevelled suit, and held a crumpled letter in his gloved hand. "My name is Reginald Wakefield," he began, his voice shaking. "I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because Scotland Yard is baffled. My brother, Charles Wakefield, was found dead in his study this morning under the most extraordinary circumstances." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed upon the man. "Pray, be precise, Mr. Wakefield. What makes his death extraordinary?" Reginald took a deep breath. "He was alone in a locked room, Mr. Holmes. The door was bolted from the inside, and the windows were sealed. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no weapon. He was seated at his desk as if he had simply dozed off. But he was dead. The doctor who examined him found no wounds, no signs of violence. The only thing of note was this letter." He held it out with trembling fingers. Holmes accepted the letter, scrutinizing it closely before sniffing the paper. "Intriguing," he murmured. "You say this was found in his possession?" Yes, it was still clutched in his hand. Watson, peering over Holmes's shoulder, saw that the letter contained only a few lines of scrawled text, but its content was meaningless, a jumble of letters and symbols. Holmes tapped his fingers together. "A locked-room mystery, a cryptic message, and a victim who appears to have perished without cause. Indeed, Mr. Wakefield, you were right to come to me." He rose abruptly, reaching for his coat and hat. "Watson, I believe an examination of this study is in order. Mr. Wakefield, we shall accompany you at once. The game, it seems, is already afoot." Chapter 2. The Case Begins. Holmes and Watson's First Discussion. The cab ride to Wakefield Manor was an uneasy one. The gas lamps cast a dim glow upon the cobbled streets, and the clatter of hooves echoed through the mist-laden air. Holmes sat with his hands steepled beneath his chin, his piercing eyes staring out into the darkness. Watson, accustomed to his friend's moments of silent concentration, refrained from interrupting. Reginald Wakefield, however, fidgeted in his seat, his nerves fraying with every passing moment. "Mr. Holmes," he finally blurted, "I cannot fathom how my brother met his end. It makes no sense. He was perfectly well last night, and now dead with no mark upon him." Holmes turned his gaze toward Wakefield, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about your brother's habits, Mr. Wakefield. Did he have any known enemies?" Reginald hesitated. "Enemies? No, I wouldn't say so. Charles was a reserved man, deeply involved in his business affairs. He owned a shipping company and was quite successful, but I cannot think of anyone who would wish him harm." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And what of the letter found in his hand? Had you ever seen such writing before?" Reginald shook his head. "Never. It's utter nonsense, isn't it? Just a meaningless jumble of symbols." Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "There is no such thing as meaningless writing, Mr. Wakefield. Only messages that have yet to be deciphered." Watson, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Could it be some form of a code? Holmes inclined his head. "Possibly. Or it may serve another purpose, one we have yet to uncover." The cab slowed, and Wakefield Manor emerged through the fog. A grand yet foreboding estate, its Gothic spires silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The house was eerily silent as they stepped onto the gravel path. A butler, an elderly man with a gaunt face, opened the door. "Mr. Wakefield, sir. The inspector is waiting inside." As they entered, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard greeted them with an impatient nod. "Holmes, I might have known you'd turn up. Though I warn you, this case is already proving to be a confounded mess." Holmes removed his coat with deliberate ease. "Indeed? Then I suspect I shall find it quite entertaining." Lestrade scoffed, but led them toward the study where the tragedy had unfolded. Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping the room before stepping inside. "Watson," he murmured, "take note of everything. The solution, I suspect, lies in the details." And with that, the great detective set to work. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. The study was undisturbed since the discovery of Charles Wakefield's body. A single oil lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls lined with books and maritime charts. The scent of old parchment and ink mixed with the faint traces of pipe smoke still lingering in the air. Charles Wakefield sat slumped over his desk, his head resting on the polished mahogany surface. His expression was eerily peaceful, as if he had merely drifted into a deep sleep rather than succumbed to death. In one lifeless hand he clutched the cryptic letter. Holmes approached the body with measured steps, his sharp eyes scanning the room with meticulous care. He produced a magnifying glass from his pocket and began his examination. Watson, who had seen death in its many brutal forms on the battlefield, nonetheless felt a chill at the unnatural stillness of the scene. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he bent low, scrutinizing the fingertips of the deceased. Then, with a swift motion, he turned his attention to the ink bottle on the desk. He sniffed its contents and arched an eyebrow. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, observe, there is no sign of struggle, no visible wounds. And yet, something is decidedly amiss." Lestrade, who had been watching with thinly veiled impatience, folded his arms. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows shut. No one could have entered or left without being seen. No wounds, no poison found in the glass of water beside him. It's as if the man simply ceased to live. Holmes straightened, tapping his fingers against the edge of the desk. The simplest explanations are often the most misleading, Inspector. Consider, if there was no obvious means of murder, then we must look for the unobvious. He turned, his attention to the letter still gripped in the dead man's hand. Using a pair of tweezers, he carefully removed it and held it up to the light. The strange symbols and letters seemed hastily scrawled, lacking the precision of ordinary handwriting. Watson leaned in. "Do you recognize the script?" Holmes was silent for a moment, then suddenly brought the letter close to his nose again. A slow smile crept across his lips. "Ah, here is our first clue, gentlemen." Reginald Wakefield took a step forward. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Holmes carefully placed the letter on the desk and turned to Watson. "Tell me, my dear doctor, what do you notice about this room?" Watson frowned, glancing around. "It is tidy, undisturbed. Nothing appears out of place except for—" He hesitated, then added, "The lamp. It is still burning, though Charles was found early in the morning. That means it was lit all night." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Now, consider. This letter, it bears the scent of almonds." Watson's breath caught. "Almonds? Holmes, you suspect—" "Precisely." Holmes retrieved a small vial from his pocket and sprinkled a few drops of liquid onto the letter. The reaction was immediate. A faint discoloration appeared on the edges of the paper. "Gentlemen," Holmes said calmly, "this letter was laced with poison." A stunned silence filled the room. Reginald Wakefield gasped. "Poison? But how? Why?" Holmes tapped the letter lightly. A cunning method indeed. The victim handled the letter, and through simple contact, the toxin was absorbed into his skin. Given the scent, I would wager we are dealing with a variant of cyanide. Possibly an exotic derivative, slow-acting yet deadly. Lestrade's face darkened. "You mean to say he was murdered by a letter?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Murder, Inspector, is rarely so direct. Someone wanted Mr. Wakefield dead in a manner that would baffle the authorities." Watson exhaled sharply. "And it nearly succeeded." Holmes turned back to the desk, his mind already racing. "The question now is, who sent this letter, and why?" He fixed his gaze upon Reginald. "Mr. Wakefield, I must insist, who would benefit most from your brother's death?" Reginald swallowed hard. His business rivals, perhaps. But Charles was not a man of enemies, at least none that I knew of. Holmes folded his arms. "Then we must assume his enemy was one he never saw coming." He glanced at the cryptic message on the poisoned letter once more, his keen eyes narrowing. "And I suspect, Watson, that this letter is not only the murder weapon, but also the killer's calling card. Chapter 4. A Hidden Message and a Dangerous Game. The room remained eerily silent after Holmes's revelation. The poisoned letter had transformed an already strange case into something far more sinister. Murder by correspondence. It was a method, both devious and precise. Lestrade cleared his throat, his usual skepticism laced with a grudging respect. "So, we have our method, but the bigger question remains, who sent this letter?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and to answer that, we must first determine how this letter reached Charles Wakefield." He turned to Reginald. "Who delivered the letter?" Reginald hesitated. I don't know. Charles received a great deal of correspondence, but his letters were typically delivered by our house staff or arrived with the morning post. Holmes steepled his fingers in thought. Then we must consider the simplest possibility. Someone within the house delivered this letter to him. Reginald paled. You mean the killer is one of us? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the desk and carefully examined the other papers strewn about. Receipts, business correspondence, and a few personal letters, all seemingly normal. But something caught his eye. Watson, bring that lamp closer. Watson complied, and Holmes held the poisoned letter near the light. The ink shimmered oddly under the flickering glow, revealing faint indentations beneath the writing. "Aha!" Holmes murmured. "A hidden message." Lestrade stepped forward. "What do you mean? There's nothing but gibberish on that paper." Holmes traced a gloved finger over the markings. "Invisible ink, my dear Inspector. The primary text is a ruse. The real message lies beneath." Watson leaned in. "Can you decipher it?" Holmes withdrew a small vial from his coat and dabbed a few drops of a clear liquid onto the letter. Almost instantly, faint words began to emerge beneath the strange symbols. Reginald gasped. "It's English!" Holmes read the words aloud. "3. Debt is paid in blood. Justice comes for those who betray." A heavy silence filled the room. Lestrade frowned. "Justice? What kind of justice is this?" Holmes exhaled sharply. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we must determine." Reginald, visibly shaken, turned to Holmes. "You think this letter was some kind of warning?" Holmes shook his head. "Not a warning, Mr. Wakefield. A judgment. Someone believed your brother deserved to die." Reginald's voice was barely above a whisper. "But why?" Holmes studied the letter again. "The phrasing suggests retribution. Someone felt wronged. By Charles Wakefield. We must find out who." Lestrade crossed his arms. "So, where do we begin?" Holmes straightened. "With the staff. Someone inside this house either delivered the letter or saw something they aren't admitting." Watson nodded. "Then we should question them immediately." Holmes gave a rare smile. "Indeed, my dear Watson. The game, as they say, is afoot." Chapter 5. The Gathering of Suspects. The heavy atmosphere inside the Wakefield estate thickened as Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Lestrade prepared to question the household staff. The murder of Charles Wakefield had taken a chilling turn with the discovery of the poisoned letter, and now the investigation was moving towards those who might have seen or even delivered the fatal correspondence. Reginald Wakefield, still visibly shaken, had called for all the household servants to assemble in the drawing-room. The room, once an elegant space of quiet refinement, now bore the weight of suspicion. 5 individuals stood before them, each a potential key to the mystery. There was Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper, a stern but respectable woman with greying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Beside her stood James Weller, the butler, a thin man with a deeply lined face and the stiff posture of someone who had served the aristocracy for decades. The maid, Anna Pearson, looked particularly nervous, clutching the hem of her apron as though it might shield her from the tension in the room. George Lyle, the footman, was a tall, well-built young man with an expression of wary alertness. Lastly, there was Mr. Oliver Graves, Wakefield's personal secretary, a bespectacled man with neatly combed hair and an air of quiet intelligence. Holmes wasted no time. He stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over the group. One of you, knowingly or unknowingly, handled a letter that brought death to Mr. Wakefield. I suggest you answer truthfully, for deception will serve you no advantage. The statement sent a ripple of unease through the gathered staff. Holmes turned to Mrs. Harper first. You are responsible for overseeing the household operations. Did you observe anything unusual concerning Mr. Wakefield's correspondence? The housekeeper pursed her lips. I handle the household, sir, but I don't concern myself with Mr. Wakefield's personal letters. Those were usually delivered to his study and left on his desk. Holmes nodded and turned his attention to Weller, the butler. And you? Who normally retrieved the letters from the post? I did, sir, Weller answered with precision. Every morning I would collect the letters from the postman and place them in Mr. Wakefield's study. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Did you handle yesterday's letters? I did, Weller confirmed, then hesitated. Though something was odd. Lestrade's interest piqued. Odd? How so? The butler hesitated, then cleared his throat. Mr. Wakefield's letters are usually in a neat stack, but yesterday, when I went to place them on his desk, they were already there. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Already there? That suggests someone else brought them in before you. Yes, sir. I found it peculiar, but I assumed Mr. Graves had handled them. Holmes turned to the secretary. Mr. Graves, is that true? The secretary adjusted his glasses. No, Mr. Holmes. I had no part in handling Mr. Wakefield's letters. Holmes was silent for a moment, then looked at the maid Anna. Miss Pearson, did you enter Mr. Wakefield's study before his death? The maid's hands trembled slightly. I did, sir, but only to tidy up. I didn't touch any letters, I swear it. Holmes studied her carefully before shifting his focus to George Lyle, the footman. And you, Mr. Lyle, did you enter the study at any point? The young man hesitated before nodding. Yes, sir. I was asked to bring in some tea for Mr. Wakefield in the afternoon. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And when you did you notice anything unusual about the letters on his desk? Lyle frowned. Now that you mention it, yes, one letter seemed out of place. The others were stacked neatly, but one had been placed directly in the centre of his desk, almost as if it had been positioned deliberately. Watson exhaled. That must have been the poisoned letter. Lestrade stepped forward. So, someone placed it there before Weller arrived with the Morning Post. Holmes folded his arms. Precisely, which means one of two things. Either someone within this house intercepted the letter and delivered it to Wakefield themselves, or... He trailed off, deep in thought. Reginald Wakefield, who had been silent throughout the interrogation, finally spoke. Or what, Mr. Holmes? Holmes turned to him. Or Mr. Wakefield was expecting this letter, so much so that he sought it out before the usual post was delivered. A heavy pause followed. The implications were troubling. Had Charles Wakefield knowingly opened a letter that led to his death? Or had the killer ensured that he would find it at just the right moment? Holmes straightened. One thing is certain. The letter did not arrive by accident. It was placed with purpose, and whoever did so is either in this house or had access to it. Lestrade's face darkened. You mean the murderer is among us? Holmes gave a tight smile. It is becoming increasingly likely. The room fell into silence once more, the weight of suspicion pressing upon them all. Holmes glanced at Watson, his eyes gleaming with calculation. We are closing in on the truth, my dear Watson, but the final pieces of this puzzle remain hidden, and with that, the game continued. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. The shadows of the Wakefield estate seemed to stretch longer as evening approached, casting a sombre gloom over its occupants. The weight of suspicion hung heavy in the air, each member of the household acutely aware that a murderer could be among them. Holmes, however, seemed energized by the tension. His sharp gaze flitted from one person to the next, absorbing details that no one else could see. Watson, standing beside him, stole a glance at his friend. He had seen this look before, the look of a man on the verge of discovery. Lestrade, meanwhile, paced impatiently. We have a house full of people, but no clear suspect. If the letter was deliberately placed, who had the means to do so? Holmes folded his arms and leaned against the mantelpiece, his eyes settling on the butler, James. Weller, you said something curious earlier, Mr. Weller. You claim you always place the post on Mr. Wakefield's desk, correct? Yes, sir. Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. Yet, yesterday morning, you found the letters were already there. The butler hesitated before nodding. That's correct. Holmes's voice remained even, but there was an edge to it. And you did not find this odd enough to mention it immediately. I suppose I thought little of it at the time, Weller admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Holmes stepped closer. If you did not place them there, then who did? A moment of silence followed. No one spoke. Holmes exhaled, then turned, abruptly to Oliver Graves, the secretary. Mr. Graves, you stated earlier that you had no part in handling Mr. Wakefield's letters. However, I must ask, when was the last time you saw the deceased alive? Graves adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but low. Shortly before lunch, Mr. Holmes. He was in his study when I left him. And the letters, they were on his desk when I departed. Holmes's eyes flickered with intrigue. And did you notice anything peculiar about them? Graves hesitated, his fingers tightening around his notepad. Now that you mention it, there was something unusual. The top letter, Mr. Wakefield had set it aside separately, as though he intended to read it at once. Watson leaned forward. That must have been the poisoned letter. Indeed, Holmes murmured, which raises a troubling question. If the letters were delivered in the morning, and Mr. Wakefield did not go out to collect them himself, then someone had already interfered with them before he even touched them. Lestrade frowned. But that means precisely, Holmes said smoothly. The fatal letter was deliberately placed within reach before Wakefield even read it, which suggests... He suddenly cut himself off, his gaze snapping to the corner of the room. The others followed his line of sight. At first there seemed to be nothing there but a writing desk and a few scattered papers. But Holmes strode purposefully toward it, his eyes gleaming. He reached down and picked up something barely noticeable. A single crumpled envelope. Watson stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. Another letter. Holmes studied it carefully before answering. No, Watson, this is the original envelope of the poisoned letter. He turned it over, holding it to the light. And here we find something quite curious. He tapped his finger along the paper, drawing attention to an almost imperceptible smudge near the flap. It was faint, but under closer inspection, Watson could see a residue, something that darkened the paper ever so slightly. Holmes inhaled deeply. A trace of a chemical solution. If I am correct, this is where the poison was applied. A hushed murmur passed through the room. Lestrade stepped forward. So the poison wasn't in the letter itself. It was on the envelope. Exactly, Holmes confirmed. Whoever sent this intended for Wakefield to absorb the poison by touch. He turned sharply, facing the group. And that tells us something very important. Watson frowned. What do you mean? Holmes's expression darkened. It tells us that the murderer knew Wakefield would open this letter personally. They anticipated his actions. And that, my dear Watson, suggests intimate knowledge of his habits. A fresh wave of unease swept through the room. Holmes glanced between the suspects. I suspect that whoever placed the poisoned letter was no mere outsider. This was done by someone with access, someone who understood Wakefield's routine, his sharp gaze locked onto each face. And that narrows our field considerably. Lestrade straightened. You're saying one of them did it? Holmes simply smiled. Let us not get ahead of ourselves, Inspector. The game is still afoot, but Watson knew better. Holmes had already seen something, a thread in the tangled web of lies, and once he had hold of a thread, he never let go. The true hunt had begun. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. The Wakefield estate had settled into an uneasy silence by the time night fell. The discovery of the poisoned envelope had sent ripples through the household, and despite Lestrade's insistence that no one should leave the premises, a palpable sense of dread remained. The murderer was among them, and Holmes knew that fear had a way of loosening even the tightest lips. Watson found himself pacing the drawing-room, where Holmes stood at the fireplace, deep in thought. The flickering flames cast elongated shadows across his sharp features, but his mind was elsewhere, weaving together fragments of the puzzle. Lestrade, seated stiffly by the window, drummed his fingers against his knee. We've got a poisoned letter, a house full of nervous suspects, and no solid lead. This case is going in circles, Holmes. Holmes arched an eyebrow. On the contrary, Inspector, we are making significant progress. Lestrade scoffed. We? We've got the envelope, yes, but no idea who tampered with it. Holmes gave a small smile. But do we not? Before Lestrade could press further, the butler, Weller, entered the room, his face pale. Begging your pardon, sirs, but something terrible has happened. Holmes turned sharply. What is it? Weller hesitated. Mr. Graves, the secretary. He's missing? Lestrade shot up from his chair. Missing? Yes, sir. He retired to his room an hour ago, but when I went to check on him, the door was open, and he was nowhere to be found. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. Without a word, Holmes strode out, his coat flaring behind him. Watson and Lestrade followed closely as they ascended the staircase to the east wing, where Graves' quarters were located. Upon reaching the secretary's room, Holmes stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over every detail. The bed was untouched, and Graves' belongings remained in place. However, the wardrobe door was ajar, and something about it caught Holmes's eye. He stepped forward, running his fingers along the edge of the wooden frame. Then, with a sudden motion, he pushed against the side panel. A faint click echoed in the quiet room. Watson watched in astonishment as a concealed compartment in the wardrobe slid open, revealing a bundle of documents hastily stuffed inside. Lestrade frowned. "What the devil?" Holmes pulled the papers free and scanned them quickly. His expression grew darker with each passing second. Finally, he held one up for Watson and Lestrade to see. It was a letter, signed by Charles Wakefield himself. Watson read aloud, "To my trusted secretary Oliver Graves, should anything befall me under suspicious circumstances, I implore you to act with haste. There are those within my circle whom I no longer trust. I fear I have become entangled in something far greater than I first realized. If I am silenced, know that the answer lies within the coded ledger in my study. Burn this letter after reading it. Time is short." A heavy silence followed. Lestrade was the first to speak. "Well, I'll be damned." Watson turned to Holmes. "This means Wakefield knew he was in danger." Holmes nodded, his fingers tightening around the letter. "And more importantly, he entrusted Graves with this knowledge. Which begs the question, where is Graves now?" Lestrade swore under his breath. If someone found out he had this letter... A sudden cry echoed through the halls. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Holmes spun on his heel. "Quickly!" They dashed down the corridor, following the sound until they reached the back of the house. A narrow servant's stairwell led down toward the garden entrance. The door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Beyond it, in the moonlit garden, a dark figure lay sprawled on the ground. Watson rushed forward, kneeling beside the body. His breath caught. "It's Graves." Lestrade knelt beside him. "Is he?" Watson pressed his fingers against the man's neck. A faint pulse. "He's alive, but barely." Holmes crouched next to them, his sharp gaze sweeping over Graves' form. His hands were clenched, and his collar was torn as if he had struggled against someone. But what truly caught Holmes's attention was the small glass vial resting inches from Graves' hand. He picked it up, holding it to the moonlight. Watson inhaled sharply. "Poison!" Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yes, and someone wanted to make sure Mr. Graves never spoke again. Lestrade looked around. Whoever did this must still be close. Holmes's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Indeed, Inspector. The hunter has revealed themselves." Watson swallowed hard. The case had just taken a far deadlier turn. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The garden was bathed in the pale glow of moonlight, the scent of damp earth hanging heavy in the crisp night air. Watson pressed his fingers against Oliver Graves's neck again, reassuring himself that the man still clung to life. The secretary's breathing was shallow, his lips tinged a faint blue. Holmes crouched beside him, rolling the small vial between his fingers. His expression was unreadable, but Watson knew that the great detective's mind was working faster than ever. Lestrade, standing stiffly nearby, surveyed the garden. His hand rested on his revolver as he muttered, "No sign of the attacker. Damn it, Holmes, what do you make of this?" Holmes ignored the question. Instead, he leaned closer to Graves and examined the man's trembling hands. "Watson, your medical bag." Watson, still kneeling, wasted no time retrieving it. "What are you thinking?" Holmes held up the vial. "If my suspicion is correct, this poison is fast-acting, but not immediately fatal. We may still have time to counteract its effects." Watson quickly mixed a solution, administering it to Graves with practiced efficiency. The man groaned weakly, his eyelids fluttering. "Good," Holmes murmured. "He will live, for now." Lestrade exhaled, clearly relieved. "Then we can question him as soon as he comes to." Holmes didn't reply. Instead, he stood and turned his gaze toward the Wakefield estate. The windows gleamed faintly against the darkness, each one a possible vantage point from which an unseen figure might be watching them. Watson followed his gaze. "Holmes." Holmes remained silent for a long moment. Then, as if coming to a decision, he said, "Inspector, I believe it is time we set a trap." Lestrade frowned. "A trap?" Holmes gave him a sidelong glance. "The culprit has twice attempted to silence those who might uncover the truth. First Wakefield, now Graves. They are growing desperate, and desperation, my dear Lestrade, makes people reckless." Lestrade folded his arms. "Go on." Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "The attacker likely believes Graves is dead or soon will be. They won't take any further risks tonight." Watson glanced at the unconscious secretary. "But Graves might not remember what happened when he wakes." "Precisely," Holmes said, "which is why we must encourage our enemy to act again, on our terms." Lestrade scowled. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We let it be known that Graves has survived and that he remembers everything." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You mean—" Holmes nodded. "We spread the word that Graves will make a full recovery and will be speaking to Scotland Yard in the morning. If our murderer is as desperate as I suspect, they will not let him live to see the sunrise." Watson stiffened. "You mean to use him as bait?" Holmes tilted his head. "Not quite. We will ensure Graves is safe while making it appear that he is vulnerable. The true bait, dear Watson, is the illusion of opportunity." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "And when the villain takes the bait—" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "We shall be waiting." Setting the trap within the hour, the Wakefield estate was abuzz with hushed conversation. Holmes had ensured that news of Graves's survival spread swiftly through the household. Every servant, every guest, and every suspect knew that the secretary was resting under close watch, expected to regain full consciousness by morning. Meanwhile, Lestrade arranged for a uniformed constable to stand guard outside Graves' door, a deep show of protection meant to reassure and provoke. Holmes, however, had different plans. As the household settled into uneasy silence, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade positioned themselves in an adjacent room, just out of sight. Graves, still unconscious, remained under Watson's careful eye. Lestrade checked his revolver. "You really think they'll strike tonight?" Holmes smirked. "Oh, they will. The question is, how?" The minutes dragged by. The candle on the bedside table flickered. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Then, a faint creak. Watson barely breathed. Lestrade's grip tightened on his revolver. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the door. Another creak. Closer this time. A shadow shifted beneath the doorframe. A pause. Then the door handle turned. Holmes moved first. In a flash, he yanked the door open, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness. The intruder gasped, stepping back, but Holmes seized their wrist with unrelenting strength. "Going somewhere?" Holmes asked, his voice smooth as silk. The candlelight spilled over the intruder's face. Watson inhaled sharply. It was Miss Eleanor Wakefield. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. Candlelight cast a flickering glow on Eleanor Wakefield's pale face. Her breath came in rapid, shallow bursts as Holmes tightened his grip on her wrist. Watson, still kneeling by Graves' bedside, was momentarily stunned. Lestrade recovered first. "Well, well," the inspector muttered, stepping forward. "What exactly do we have here?" Eleanor's eyes darted between them, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Holmes observed her keenly. "Miss Wakefield, I must commend you on your bravery, or perhaps your desperation. It is not every day that a murderer attempts a second strike with an entire household on alert." She wrenched her arm free. I don't know what you mean," Lestrade scoffed. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were sneaking into Mr. Graves' room at this hour." Eleanor's fingers twisted together. I was only checking on him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Curious, given that, just hours ago, you barely seemed concerned for his well-being." She hesitated. I heard the servants talking. They said he might wake soon, that he remembered everything. I wanted to see for myself." Holmes gave a small smile. To see, or to ensure that he never woke at all? Her face blanched. "No, that's not true." Watson stood now, unable to remain silent. "Then what were you planning to do?" Eleanor's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Holmes sighed. "Very well, Miss Wakefield. If you truly intended no harm, I trust you won't mind us searching you for any unsavoury items?" Eleanor gasped. "You wouldn't dare!" Lestrade crossed his arms. "Wouldn't I? I've got plenty of reason to suspect you." For a moment she looked as though she might protest further, but then, with a quiet sob, she relented. She turned out the pockets of her dressing gown, revealing a small folded cloth and a tiny glass vial. Lestrade snatched it up, holding it to the light. The liquid inside shimmered darkly. Watson's stomach turned. "Another dose of the poison," he murmured. Eleanor backed away, shaking her head. I didn't mean—" Holmes tilted his head. "You didn't mean what, Miss Wakefield? Didn't mean to get caught?" She took a shaky breath. "It's not what you think." Lestrade scowled. "That's a bit hard to believe, considering we've got you red-handed." Holmes, however, was watching her with careful interest. "And yet, she is not the one." Lestrade turned sharply. "Not the one?" What are you on about, Holmes? We just caught her trying to poison. Graves! Holmes tapped the vial with his index finger. An act of guilt, yes, but not of murder. Eleanor's eyes widened. You believe me? Holmes turned to her. No, but I do believe you are merely a pawn in this game. Lestrade exhaled sharply. You mean there's someone else? Holmes' expression darkened. Oh, yes, and they are watching us, even now. The true murderer moves. The realization sent a chill down Watson's spine. Somewhere, in the vast estate, the true culprit lurked in the shadows, perhaps even waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Eleanor, still trembling, clasped her hands together. I swear, I only— Holmes cut her off with a raised hand. Enough, Miss Wakefield. Your role in this affair is clear enough for now. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, place her under watch, but do not arrest her yet. Lestrade frowned. Not arrest her. Holmes, she just— I assure you, her actions were not of her own volition. If we press too hard now, the real criminal may slip through our grasp. Lestrade grumbled but relented, instructing a constable to keep Eleanor under strict watch. Holmes turned to Watson. Come, my dear friend. The night is not yet over, and there is work to be done. Watson followed Holmes out of the room, casting one last glance at Graves, who remained unconscious. They moved through the darkened halls of the Wakefield estate, the silence pressing in around them. Holmes's expression was unreadable, his mind clearly racing. Finally, Watson broke the silence. Holmes, if Eleanor isn't the one, then why did she try to finish the job? Holmes smirked. A fascinating question, is it not? Watson exhaled in frustration. Don't toy with me, man. Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to him. Very well, Watson. Consider this. Miss Wakefield was undoubtedly trying to ensure Graves did not wake. But why? Watson frowned. Because she didn't want him to speak. Exactly. But if she were the true murderer, would she have acted in such a clumsy, desperate manner? Watson hesitated. I suppose not. Holmes nodded. The real murderer, I suspect, has been manipulating her. She is afraid, driven to act not by cunning, but by panic. Watson's mind reeled. Then that means— Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. The true villain has been orchestrating this from the very beginning. And now, Watson, I intend to smoke them out. Watson swallowed hard. Whoever this unseen enemy was, they were far more dangerous than they had first believed. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The halls of the Wakefield estate were eerily silent as Holmes and Watson moved through the dim corridors. A storm had begun to gather outside, the distant rumble of thunder echoing through the vast mansion. Holmes walked with purpose, his keen eyes scanning every shadow as though expecting the murderer to emerge at any moment. Watson, still troubled by the night's events, finally spoke. Holmes, if Miss Wakefield is not the true culprit, then who is? And what is their real motive? Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. Ah, Watson, the pieces are slowly falling into place. But tell me, what do we know so far? Watson took a deep breath. The first victim, Lord Percival Wakefield, received a poisoned letter and died shortly after. The second victim, Mr. Graves, was poisoned as well, but he survived, though someone attempted to finish him off tonight. Miss Eleanor Wakefield was caught in the act, but you believe she was acting out of fear rather than guilt. That means the real killer is someone else, someone manipulating events from the shadows. Holmes nodded approvingly. Precisely. And if we are to find them, we must understand their motive. Watson frowned. At first, it seemed like a simple case of murder for inheritance. Eleanor stood to gain from her uncle's death, but if she was merely a pawn, then the true culprit must have a deeper reason. Holmes stopped at the end of the corridor and turned toward Watson. Deeper, indeed. The key lies in the letter. Watson blinked. The poisoned letter. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Exactly. Someone went to great lengths to ensure Lord Wakefield's death. A poisoned letter is not a crime of passion. It is a crime of calculation. And yet, why did the killer strike again with Mr. Graves? If Wakefield's death served their purpose, why risk exposure? Watson hesitated. Unless Graves knew something that could unravel their plan. Holmes smiled. Now you are thinking like a detective, Watson. Graves must have possessed knowledge that made him a threat, which means a sudden crash echoed through the house, followed by a muffled cry. Holmes spun on his heel. Come, Watson! The game is afoot! A desperate act. They raced through the corridors, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The sound had come from the study, the very room where Lord Wakefield had received his fatal letter. Holmes threw open the door. A man stood in the centre of the study, his hands shaking as he rifled through the desk drawers. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with panic. Mr. Theodore Lane, Holmes announced, his voice sharp. We finally meet. The butler whirled around, clutching a yellowed envelope in his trembling fingers. His breath came in rapid gasps. I don't know what you mean, sir. Holmes stepped forward. Oh, I think you do. You have been the ever-loyal servant of this house for many years, have you not? And yet, tonight, you are reduced to a desperate thief, rummaging through your late master's belongings. Lane's grip on the envelope tightened. I was only... Holmes's voice was low and steady. You were looking for something you feared would expose the truth. Lestrade arrived at the door, panting. Holmes, what's happening? Holmes barely acknowledged him. His gaze remained locked on Lane. Tell me, Mr. Lane, how long have you served the Wakefield family? Lane swallowed hard. 20 years. Holmes nodded. 20 years of faithful service, 20 years of loyalty, and 20 years of watching others enjoy wealth and privilege while you remained in the shadows. Lane's face darkened. I don't know what you're implying. Holmes took another step forward. Lord Wakefield trusted you, and yet I suspect he discovered something that forced your hand. Lane's jaw clenched. That's ridiculous. Holmes tilted his head. Is it? Then tell me, why did you kill him? Lestrade gasped. Watson stiffened. Lane's eyes widened in sheer terror. Holmes pressed on. You poisoned Lord Wakefield because he had uncovered a truth you wished to keep buried, a truth that threatened your very existence. Lane took a step back. No, I didn't. Holmes continued, his voice unwavering. But you made a mistake, didn't you? Mr. Graves knew. He saw something, heard something. And when he, survived the poisoning. You realized your secret was not yet safe. Lane's breath came in shallow gasps. Holmes held out his hand. Give me the letter. Lane hesitated for a single agonizing moment. Then he bolted. The chase Lane dashed past them, knocking over a chair in his desperation. Holmes and Watson gave chase, with Lestrade close behind. Through the corridors they ran, the storm outside, raging with renewed fury. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating Lane's frantic figure as he tore through the house. They burst into the great hall just as Lane reached the front doors. Holmes shouted, "Lane, stop!" But the butler did not stop. He yanked open the doors and froze. Standing in the rain-drenched courtyard was a lone figure, a man tall and broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. Mr. Graves, alive, awake, and waiting. Lane let out a strangled gasp. His grip loosened, and the letter fluttered to the ground. Holmes approached, his voice calm but firm. "It's over, Lane." The butler fell to his knees, his body shaking. I had no choice." Graves stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "No, Lane, you had every choice." Watson picked up the fallen letter, turning it over in his hands. The name on the front was faded, but the words were clear. To Lord Percival Wakefield, a matter of grave importance. Holmes smiled grimly. "And now, gentlemen, we shall finally uncover the truth." Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes's Grand Strategy. The butler, Theodore Lane, knelt motionless in the grand hall, rainwater pooling at his feet from the open doors. His hands trembled, his breath coming in short gasps. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him like an iron vice. Holmes stood before him, studying him with cold precision. Watson, still gripping the letter, felt his own pulse quicken. Whatever was written inside, it had been important enough to kill for. Lestrade stepped forward, his expression hard. "Lane, you're under arrest. I hope you've got a good solicitor, because you'll need one." Holmes raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet, Inspector. There is still one final move to be made." Lestrade frowned. "What are you on about? The man's confessed." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. He has only broken, not confessed. And until he does, we do not have the full truth." Lane swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the letter Watson held. It doesn't matter now. You've won, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. "Have I?" Watson glanced at his friend, puzzled. "Holmes, what are you planning?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out his pocket watch. He flipped it open, studying the time. Then, with a slight nod, he snapped it shut and slipped it back into his pocket. Turning to Lestrade, he spoke with quiet authority. "Inspector, I need you to do something for me." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Announce, in the morning, papers, that Lane has made a full confession." Watson blinked. "But he hasn't." Holmes placed a hand on Watson's shoulder. "Precisely, my dear fellow, and that is why we must say that he has." Lestrade hesitated. "A false report? That's highly irregular." Holmes nodded. "It is, but trust me when I say it is necessary. The true puppet master of this crime has yet to reveal themselves." Lane's head shot up. "I don't understand." Holmes crouched before him, locking eyes with the broken man. "You were not acting. Alone, were you, Lane?" Lane's lips parted, but no words came. Holmes's voice was softer now. "You killed Wakefield, and you tried to kill Graves, but you were not the mastermind. You were simply used." Lane clenched his fists, his jaw tight. Holmes continued. "If you had succeeded in killing Graves tonight, you would have been eliminated next. You were never meant to survive this plot." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "You mean someone was going to do him in too?" Holmes stood. "Indeed. And now, gentlemen, we will let the real murderer believe Lane has confessed. And when they think the danger is past, they will make their final move." Watson stared at his friend. "And you expect them to fall for it?" Holmes smiled. "Without question, the waiting game." The following morning, the Times carried a bold headline: "Breakthrough in Wakefield Murder. Butler confesses to cold-blooded crime." Holmes had made sure the article was filled with carefully chosen details. Enough truth to be convincing, but not so much as to scare off their hidden adversary. The trap was set. Now, all they had to do was wait. Lestrade had stationed 2 officers outside the Wakefield estate, but Holmes insisted on keeping a minimal presence. "We must make them feel safe," he had explained. "A frightened criminal makes mistakes, but a confident one walks straight into our hands." Hours passed. The house was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the staff. Lane had been locked away under close watch. The real killer, whoever they were, must have seen the news by now. Watson paced the sitting room, glancing toward Holmes, who lounged in an armchair with his eyes half closed. He looked as though he were asleep, but Watson knew better. Finally, as dusk approached, there was a sound, a gentle click from the study door. Holmes's eyes snapped open. Watson's breath caught in his throat. Someone was inside. Silently, Holmes rose to his feet, signaling for Watson to follow. The two moved like shadows, creeping toward the study. Holmes placed a hand on the doorknob, then turned it slowly. The door swung open without a sound. Inside, a figure stood by the fireplace, a gloved hand reaching toward the pile of letters on the desk. The dim light cast long shadows over their face. Watson gasped. "You?" The figure whirled, eyes wide with shock. Holmes stepped forward. "Good evening, Lady Margaret Wakefield." The final player. Revealed Lady Margaret's face paled. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she straightened, smoothing down her elegant dress. "Mr. Holmes," she said evenly, "I was not expecting company." Holmes gave a small bow. "And yet here we are." Lestrade burst into the room behind them, pistol in hand. "I knew it. The widow's always suspicious," Holmes sighed. "Put that away, Inspector. Lady Margaret is not the murderer." Lestrade blinked. "She isn't?" Holmes shook his head. "No, she is something much worse." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see I have underestimated You, Mr. Holmes? Holmes folded his arms. You were the one who orchestrated everything, were you not? Theodore Lane was merely a tool, a desperate man you manipulated into carrying out your plan. Watson's mind reeled. But why? What could you possibly gain from all this? Holmes gestured toward the pile of letters on the desk. Power, dear Watson. Influence. Lord Wakefield possessed documents that could have ruined many powerful people, including Lady Margaret herself. But rather than steal them outright, she devised a plan, one that would see Wakefield dead, Lane arrested, and the evidence destroyed before it could fall into the wrong hands. Margaret smiled thinly. Clever. Lestrade scowled. So, you're saying she pulled all the strings, but let Lane do the dirty work? Holmes nodded. Exactly. And when she read the false report of Lane's confession, she believed their danger had passed. She came back to retrieve the final piece of evidence, unaware that we were waiting. Watson's stomach turned. And if she had succeeded? Holmes's voice was cold. Lane would have taken the blame, and the truth would have been buried forever. Margaret's gaze flicked to the door. Holmes shook his head. I wouldn't try it. We have officers stationed outside. It is over, Lady Wakefield, Margaret sighed, as though merely inconvenienced. Then, with a graceful movement, she reached into her sleeve. Holmes reacted instantly. He lunged forward, knocking her wrist aside. A small vial slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor. A sharp, acrid scent filled the air. Holmes straightened. Poison! The same she used on Wakefield. Lestrade seized her arms. You're under arrest, my lady. Margaret smiled coolly. Well played, Mr. Holmes. Holmes merely studied her for a moment. Then, at last, he murmured, The game is over. Chapter 12. The closing of the case. Grand halls of Wakefield Manor stood eerily silent as Lady Margaret Wakefield was led away by Lestrade and his officers. The shadows cast by the dimly lit chandeliers flickered across the ornate walls, reflecting the weight of the revelations that had unravelled within these walls. Holmes, ever composed, adjusted his coat and turned back toward the study, his keen eyes lingering on the remnants of the shattered vial. The acrid scent of the poison still lingered in the air, a silent testament to how close Margaret had come to ending her own life. Watson, his brow furrowed, exhaled deeply. I still can't believe it, Holmes. All this for power? Holmes gave a small, knowing nod. Power, Watson, is the most intoxicating poison of all. Margaret Wakefield knew that the right information could make or break men of influence. With her husband's documents in her possession, she would have been untouchable. Lestrade reappeared in the doorway, dusting off his hands. She won't be getting out of this one. We found more letters in her personal study, enough to confirm her involvement in Wakefield's death and Lane's manipulation. He glanced toward Holmes, his expression begrudgingly appreciative. You did it again. Holmes smirked. I merely followed the scent of deception, Inspector. It was all laid out before us. The locked room, the butler's supposed guilt, and Lady Margaret's calculated moves. He gestured towards the broken vial on the floor. She was willing to go to any lengths to ensure her survival. Lestrade grunted. Well, she won't have much influence from a prison cell. Watson crossed his arms. And what of Theodore Lane? Holmes's expression softened, just slightly. A pawn in a much larger game. He committed crimes, but he was manipulated by a masterful player. With Lady Margaret's arrest, it is likely that Lane's sentence will be reduced, though not absolved. Watson sighed. A tragic man, caught in a web of power. Holmes nodded. Indeed. The clock on the study wall chimed, marking the late hour. The manor, though still intact, felt like the remnants of a battlefield, a place where schemes had unravelled and truth had triumphed. Lestrade clapped his hands together. Well, gentlemen, I think I owe you both a drink. It's not every day we catch a lady of high society in the act. Holmes gave a wry smile. Tempting, Inspector, but I believe Watson and I have had our fill of excitement for one evening. Watson chuckled. A quiet night at Baker Street would be most welcome. Holmes tilted his head. Though, Watson, we should expect another case soon. After all, crime never rests. With that, the great detective turned, his coat billowing as he strode toward the doors of Wakefield Manor. Watson followed, casting one last glance at the house that had harboured so many secrets. As they stepped into the cool London air, Holmes took out his pipe and lit it, inhaling deeply. The night was calm, too calm, as if the city itself was waiting for the next great mystery to unfold. And Holmes, ever the hunter, was ready. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The dim glow of gas lamps flickered along Baker Street as Holmes and I settled into our familiar sitting room. The events of Wakefield Manor had left an air of finality, but I could not shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. Holmes, however, sat in his armchair, his eyes half closed as he lazily tapped the side of his pipe against the armrest. Holmes, I began, something about this case still unsettles me. We have Lady Margaret in custody, and yet you sense the story is not quite finished. Holmes interjected smoothly, opening one keen eye to regard me. An admirable instinct, Watson. It is one I share. Before I could press further, a frantic knocking at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson's hurried steps followed, and in the next moment she burst into the room. "Inspector Lestrade is downstairs, sir," she panted. "He says it's urgent." Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Show him up!" Lestrade entered, his face paler than I had ever seen it. "Holmes, Watson, we have a problem." Holmes motioned for him to continue. "Lady Margaret Wakefield has escaped." I shot up from my chair. Escaped? But how? Lestrade grimaced. She was being transported to Newgate when the carriage was intercepted. 2 masked men attacked the guards, overpowered them, and fled with Lady Margaret into the night. We have patrols scouring the city, but she's vanished. Holmes let out a quiet chuckle. Ah, the final act. Desperation makes even the most composed minds reckless. Lestrade glared. "You seem rather amused by this, Holmes. That woman is dangerous." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "Indeed, but her options are now limited. Tell me, Lestrade, was anything left behind at the scene of the attack?" Lestrade hesitated before pulling a small folded note from his pocket. This was tucked into one of the guard's pockets. "It's addressed to you." Holmes took the note, unfolded it, and read aloud. "Sherlock Holmes, you have played your part well, but this game is not over. You may have pulled the curtain on my performance, but I will not bow. Look for me where the past still lingers. There I will have my final say. M.W. A slow smile spread across Holmes's face. How poetic! Lestrade frowned. What does it mean? Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully. She is telling us exactly where she's going. Where the past still lingers. Wakefield Manor. It is the only place that still holds significance to her. Watson looked at Holmes in alarm. Surely she wouldn't be so foolish as to return there. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Not foolish, Watson. Bold. She intends to settle unfinished business, and she is daring us to stop her. Lestrade cursed. Then we've no time to waste. We must return to Wakefield Manor at once. Holmes grabbed his coat. Indeed, the final act is upon us. With that, we rushed out into the London night, unaware of the storm that awaited us at Wakefield Manor. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The carriage rumbled through the London streets, its wheels splashing through puddles left by an evening drizzle. A thick mist had settled over the city, casting an eerie pallor over the gaslit roads. Holmes, seated across from me, remained deep in thought, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Lestrade, beside me, fidgeted impatiently. "We should have men surrounding Wakefield Manor," Lestrade grumbled. "If she's there, we'll have her cornered." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. A heavy police presence would only startle her into flight. We must approach with caution. Lady Margaret is not a common criminal. She is a woman who has carefully orchestrated her steps until now. Whatever she intends to do at Wakefield Manor, it will be her final move." Lestrade sighed. "And if we're walking into a trap?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile. "Then we shall have to spring it before she does." The manor loomed ahead as the carriage turned onto the long gravel driveway. A full moon, shrouded in thin clouds, cast pale beams over the estate. The house was dark, save for a faint glow emanating from the study where we had uncovered so many secrets just days before. Holmes was the first to disembark, moving with purpose towards the grand entrance. The door creaked as Lestrade pushed it open, and we stepped into the dimly lit hall. Silence reigned, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Holmes gestured for us to stay behind as he moved toward the study, his footsteps nearly soundless on the marble floor. Watson and I followed cautiously, our hands instinctively hovering near our coats where our revolvers rested. As we entered the study, we saw her. Lady Margaret Wakefield stood by the great wooden desk, her gloved hands resting lightly on its polished surface. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting sharp shadows across her pale face. She turned as we entered, her expression calm, too calm. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "how predictable you are." Holmes gave a small bow. "And how predictable you have become, Lady Margaret. Returning here was a most unwise decision." A small bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I disagree, Mr. Holmes. This house is mine. It has always been mine. Everything my husband built, I shaped. Everything he had, I controlled. And yet I am the one being hunted." Lestrade took a step forward. "Enough of this. You're coming with us." Lady Margaret ignored him, her gaze fixed solely on Holmes. "Tell me, detective, did you truly believe I would allow myself to be caged like an animal?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. No, that is why you returned, to tie up loose ends. But there was one flaw in your plan, one final clue that sealed your fate. Her expression flickered for the first time. And what would that be? Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, folded document. Your husband's will. A sharp intake of breath. Holmes continued, his voice steady. You killed Lord Wakefield not only to protect yourself, but to take full control of his affairs. However, what you failed to anticipate was that he had already changed his will. This document, which I retrieved from his solicitor this morning, leaves the entirety of his estate to his younger brother in India. Lady Margaret's hand clenched into a fist. Impossible! Quite possible, Holmes countered smoothly. You did not kill him soon enough, Lady Margaret. Had you acted weeks earlier, you might have secured your inheritance. But your delay cost you everything. Her breath quickened. The perfect composure she had maintained for so long was beginning to crack. Lestrade stepped forward again, this time with his hand on his revolver. It's over, Lady Margaret. For a moment, I thought she might surrender. But then, with a sudden burst of movement, she reached into her cloak and produced a small gleaming pistol. Instinctively, I reached for my own weapon, but Holmes had already anticipated her move. With a quick flick of his cane, he struck her wrist, sending the gun clattering to the floor. Lestrade lunged forward, seizing her arms before she could make another attempt. She struggled for a moment before finally going limp. The fight had left her. Holmes bent down, picked up the pistol, and examined it. A lady's derringer, a final act of desperation. Lady Margaret turned to him, her voice no more than a whisper. And what now, Mr. Holmes? Holmes exhaled slowly. Now, you face the consequences of your own design. Lestrade signalled to his men, who entered the study and secured the prisoner. As they led Lady Margaret away, she held her head high, refusing to show defeat. Only when the last of them had departed did I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Holmes moved toward the desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the polished wood. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he murmured, "the lengths to which a person will go when they feel their power slipping away." I shook my head. She had everything, and yet it wasn't enough. Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile. Such is the nature of human ambition. I turned toward him. "And what about you, Holmes? You do not seek power, yet you hold more influence than any politician in London." He chuckled softly, tapping out his pipe. "Power, my dear Watson, is merely an illusion. What I seek is the truth, and in that pursuit there are no masters." With that, he turned toward the window, gazing out into the misty night. Somewhere in the distance, the city moved on, unaware of the secrets that had just been laid to rest. And as always, Sherlock Holmes was ready for the next mystery. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The air inside the Wakefield Manor study was thick, with tension, despite the crackling fire casting a warm glow over the dark mahogany furniture. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windows, swirling in the gaslight like ghostly fingers trying to creep into the room. Holmes, standing with his back to the fireplace, His sharp eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a mind at work, surveyed the assembled suspects with an unreadable expression. Seated around the room were all the key players in this twisted affair. Lord Wakefield's solicitor, Mr. Percival Dunn, his face lined with worry, the housekeeper, Mrs. Kelsey, wringing her hands in her lap. The late Lord's brother, Geoffrey Wakefield, recently arrived from India, his sharp gaze flicking between Holmes and the others. And, of course, at the centre of it all, Lady Margaret. Wakefield, now stripped of her icy composure, sat restrained in a chair, her wrists bound lightly with rope. Lestrade's men stood near her, ensuring she would not attempt another desperate move. Lestrade himself stood by the door, arms folded across his chest. "Well, Holmes, you've gathered us here. Let's hear it." Holmes exhaled softly, clasping his hands behind his back. "Very well, Inspector. Let us examine the case one final time. Let us review what we know." He turned his piercing gaze on the room. Lord Charles Wakefield was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk. The cause of death: a rare and insidious poison, administered via a letter that he opened that very night. Mr. Dunn nodded grimly. "A cunning method indeed," Holmes continued, pacing slowly. "The letter, however, was merely the method. The motive, as always, is the true key to the mystery. And what do we find when we examine the motive?" His eyes locked onto Lady Margaret, a woman with much to lose, and even more to gain. Lady Margaret scoffed. "Baseless accusations, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, my lady, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He turned to Geoffrey Wakefield. "Tell me, sir, when did you receive word of your brother's death?" Geoffrey adjusted his collar. "A telegram reached me 3 days after the murder. I took the first available ship back to England." Holmes nodded. "Curious, is it not, that your brother did not inform you of his revised will?" Geoffrey frowned. "I assumed he hadn't gotten around to it." Holmes let out a short, knowing chuckle. "No, Mr. Wakefield. He was silenced before he could." He turned back to Lady Margaret. "You were confident, were you not, that you would inherit everything? But the truth was far more inconvenient." Lady Margaret lifted her chin defiantly, but said nothing. Holmes went on. "Had you acted a mere fortnight earlier, Lady Margaret, the estate would indeed have been yours. But by the time you finally struck, Lord Wakefield had already made arrangements to alter his will, cutting you out entirely. You were already ruined. You just didn't know it yet." Mrs. Kelsey gasped, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. Holmes gestured toward the desk. "And so, when Lord Wakefield received the fatal letter, he had already set the wheels in motion for your downfall. You must have suspected something. Perhaps you overheard him discussing it with Mr. Dunn. Dunn, I saw. Realized your time was running out." Mr. Dunn cleared his throat uneasily. I did discuss some details of the new will with his lordship, but I never imagined—" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "You are blameless, Mr. Dunn, but your conversation sealed his fate." Lestrade stepped forward. "That's all well and good, Holmes, but how do we prove it was her?" Holmes's smile deepened. "Ah, Inspector, the proof is quite simple." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. "Lady Margaret, does this handwriting look familiar to you?" For the first time, A flicker of fear crossed her face. Holmes held the parchment up for the others to see. This is a letter written by Lady Margaret herself, addressed to an acquaintance in France. A mundane correspondence of little significance. He paused, then held up another piece of parchment, one retrieved from Lord Wakefield's desk the night of his death. And this, as you may recall, is the poisoned letter that killed Lord Wakefield. Lestrade squinted. They look the same. Not just the same, Inspector. Identical. Holmes stepped toward Lady Margaret. You made a grave mistake, my lady. You are an accomplished forger, to be sure. Your imitation of Lord Wakefield's solicitor was nearly perfect when you altered documents in the past. But your own handwriting? He gave a short laugh. That, I fear, you could not disguise. From me. A heavy silence fell over the room. Lady Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps. You have nothing but supposition. Holmes raised a brow. Do I? Consider the evidence. Your financial ruin, your access to rare poisons, through your botanical studies, your growing desperation, and now this undeniable proof of forgery. And let us not forget your unfortunate slip when I confronted you last night. You already knew about the revised will before I ever mentioned it. How could you, unless you had learned of it from Lord Wakefield himself? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Lestrade stepped forward. I think we've heard enough. He nodded to his men. Take her away. As the constables moved to escort her from the room, Lady Margaret finally broke her silence. Do you think this is justice, Mr. Holmes? Her voice was low, bitter. A man like my husband, cold, unfeeling, dismissive. I gave him everything, and he discarded me like a broken ornament. Holmes met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Justice, my lady, is not measured by affection. It is measured by truth. And the truth in this case is that a life was taken for the sake of vanity and greed. She let out a slow breath. Then, with a final glance around the room, allowed herself to be led away. When the door finally closed behind them, silence lingered in the air. I turned to Holmes. It is done, then? He nodded, moving towards the fireplace and gazing into the flames. Indeed, Watson, the game is over. Lestrade chuckled. I'll never understand how you piece these things together, Holmes. Holmes smirked. Nor do I expect you to, Inspector. Lestrade shook his head in amusement before excusing himself, leaving just Holmes and me in the flickering light of the study. I poured us both a brandy and handed him a glass. Another case solved. Holmes took a sip, then set the glass down. Another case concluded, Watson. Solved? That is a matter of perspective. I frowned. You don't consider justice done? He sighed. Justice, perhaps. Satisfaction? That is another matter entirely. With that, he took up his violin and began to play, letting the mournful notes drift through the empty halls of Wakefield Manor, as outside, the London fog swallowed the night once more. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The morning after Lady Margaret's arrest, Baker Street was quiet, save for the occasional rattle of a passing carriage outside. The thick London fog had lifted, revealing a pale, wintry sun casting weak light through the sitting-room windows. Holmes sat in his usual chair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfocused. I watched him in silence for a moment before setting down my teacup. "You're unusually quiet this morning, Holmes." He exhaled slowly. "It is the weight of reflection, Watson. The case is concluded, yet I find no true triumph in it," frowned. "But we found the culprit, uncovered the scheme, and brought her to justice. What troubles you?" Holmes let out a soft chuckle. "It is not the resolution itself, but the nature of it. You see, Watson, Lady Margaret's crime was not one of mindless greed or a lust for power. It was one born of desperation, of a woman trapped in a world where she had no agency, no means of escape, save through deception and murder. There is something almost tragic in that." I sighed. "Perhaps. But we cannot excuse murder, no matter the circumstances." Holmes nodded. "No, we cannot. But understanding, Watson, that is our duty." I leaned forward. "Then explain it to me, Holmes. Every last detail." Holmes's sharp eyes flicked toward me, and with a small nod, he leaned back in his chair. "Very well, my dear Watson. Let us begin from the very first clue." The letter of death, Holmes tapped the armrest of his chair. The first and most important element of this case was the letter itself. Lord Wakefield received it on the night of his murder, opened it in his study, and within moments he was dead. This suggested two things. First, that the poison was fast-acting, and second, that it was delivered in such a way that he would come into immediate contact with it. I nodded. "You suspected the paper itself was laced with the poison?" "Precisely. I had the letter analysed, and my suspicions were confirmed. The edges were treated with a rare toxin, one derived from the Indian plant Aconitum ferox. A mere touch to the lips or tongue would be enough to cause fatal convulsions." I shuddered. A cruel method. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and a method that required specific knowledge. That narrowed the list of suspects considerably." Forged Will Holmes reached for a sheet of paper on the table beside him. Then came the matter of the will. Lord Wakefield had recently arranged to cut Lady Margaret from his inheritance. This decision was made in confidence with his solicitor, Mr. Dunn. And yet someone else knew of it. I furrowed my brow. "You realized Lady Margaret was aware of the new will before we had mentioned it?" "Ah, Watson, always so perceptive." Holmes smiled. "Indeed. When I pressed her, she faltered, just for a moment. That was all I needed. But suspicion alone is never enough. We required proof." He lifted the two letters, the poisoned one and Lady Margaret's correspondence. "The proof was in the handwriting." I exhaled. "She wrote the letter herself, didn't she?" Holmes nodded. An amateur might have overlooked it, but I recognized the distinct flourish of her capital letters, the particular way she curved the W. She forged the letter to look as if it came from a business associate of Lord Wakefield, ensuring that he would open it without hesitation. The motive and desperation, Holmes, set the letters aside. Now, as to the why. We have already established her financial ruin, her fear of being left with nothing. But there is another piece, Watson, one that struck me only as I examined. The nature of the poison. I raised an eyebrow. Which was? Holmes's gaze darkened. Aconitum ferox is not a common poison, Not in England. Its origins trace back to India, a place of significance to Geoffrey Wakefield, the late Lord's brother. I sat up straighter. You thought Geoffrey was involved? Holmes waved a hand. For a time I considered it, but upon questioning him I realized the truth. He had no knowledge of the toxin. The only person in the house with an understanding of rare botanical substances was Lady Margaret herself. I exhaled. Then she truly was the mastermind. Holmes nodded. She acquired the poison through a contact at the Botanical Society. She then used it in a final desperate attempt to secure her position before the new will could be formalized. But she miscalculated. The final clue. Holmes leaned forward. What truly sealed the case was her reaction when I presented the forged letter. You saw it, Watson, the brief flicker of fear. It is in those moments, those fractions of a second, that the truth emerges. I shook my head. It's remarkable, Holmes. Even when the criminal believes themselves untouchable, you always manage to find the thread that unravels the lie. Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile. It is not magic, my dear Watson. It is simply observation, logic, and the willingness to look deeper than the surface. The case is closed. A comfortable silence settled over the room. Holmes reached for his pipe, lighting it with practiced ease. The scent of tobacco curled in the air. I swirled my tea absently. So, what now, Holmes? He exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his eyes half-lidded. Now, my dear friend, we rest until London's shadows present us with another mystery to unravel. And so, the case of Lord Wakefield's murder was closed, and for the moment, the great detective allowed himself a rare moment of quiet. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The dim-lit chambers of Scotland Yard carried an air of grim finality as Lady Margaret sat motionless, her once poised demeanour now stripped of its elegance. The flickering gas lamp overhead cast sharp shadows across her face, accentuating the exhaustion in her weary eyes. Across the wooden table, Inspector Lestrade stood with arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed upon her. Holmes, ever the observer, remained silent, watching, waiting. I stood near the door, feeling the weight of the moment. The conclusion of a case always carried with it a strange sense of emptiness. Justice served, yet lives shattered in the process. Lestrade cleared his throat. Lady Margaret Wakefield, you are charged with the murder of Lord Arthur Wakefield. Given the premeditated nature of the crime and the use of a rare poison, the Crown will seek the most severe punishment. A bitter laugh escaped Lady Margaret's lips, hollow and devoid of emotion. Severe punishment, you say? Do you believe a woman such as I had any other choice? Her voice, though faint, still carried its aristocratic sharpness. Lestrade's expression remained unmoved. Choice or not, murder is murder. Holmes finally spoke, his voice calm, yet laced with the precision of finality. Indeed, Lady Margaret, but what you fail to comprehend is that it was not your crime alone that condemned you. It was the web of deception you wove. Had you left fewer threads untangled, perhaps you might have escaped unscathed. She turned her gaze toward Holmes. You speak as though you pity me, Mr. Holmes. He studied her for a moment before replying. No, Lady Margaret, I do not pity you, but I do understand you. A long silence settled in the room. It was Lestrade who finally broke it. "She'll be taken to Holloway Prison until the trial." With a sharp nod, he signalled to the constables. As the guards stepped forward, Lady Margaret straightened her posture. If she was to be led away in chains, she would not do so as a broken woman. She rose to her feet, turned to Holmes, and, with an air of quiet defiance, said, "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, if our positions were reversed, if society had denied you the right to live freely, what would you have done?" Holmes met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I suppose we shall never know, Lady Margaret." With that, the guards escorted her out of the chamber. The aftermath. The ride back to Baker Street was silent, save for the rhythmic clip-clop of the carriage wheels against the cobblestones. The city beyond the window was alive with movement, indifferent to the weight of the case we had just concluded. I exhaled slowly. She was a clever woman, Holmes. Clever, but desperate. Nodded, his fingers drumming against his knee. Desperation is the architect of many a crime, Watson, but even the most brilliant schemes crumble under scrutiny. I hesitated before asking, "Do you believe she ever truly loved Lord Wakefield?" Holmes considered this for a moment before answering. "Love, my dear Watson, is an enigma, even. I have yet to fully deduce. Whether she loved him once or merely played the part, we shall never know." I leaned back against the seat, and yet Lestrade will take the credit for the case, as always. Holmes chuckled. Naturally. Scotland Yard must maintain its reputation after all. I shook my head. "And you? You solve these intricate cases, unravel deceptions that would baffle the greatest minds, and yet the world seldom acknowledges your brilliance." Holmes smirked. "Recognition is a fickle thing, Watson. I require only the challenge, not the applause." The carriage slowed as we neared Baker Street. Holmes adjusted his coat and glanced at me with a knowing expression. "Besides, my dear fellow, I have no doubt that you will ensure my efforts are well documented." I chuckled. "You know me too well, Holmes. An ending or a beginning?" As we stepped into our sitting room, the comforting sight of our old chairs and the faint scent of pipe smoke filled the air. Holmes moved toward the fireplace, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. For a moment, I thought he might finally allow himself a well-earned rest, but then a sharp knock at the door shattered the stillness. I exchanged a glance with Holmes before moving to open it. A young boy, barely past his teenage years, stood in the entryway, his clothes tattered, his breath ragged. "Dr. Watson?" asked his voice quivering. "Yes, lad. What is it?" His fingers clenched into fists. "I need to speak with Mr. Holmes. It's my brother. He's missing, and there's blood on the doorstep." I turned to Holmes, but he was already reaching for his coat, and just like that, the game was afoot once more. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows across the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The hour was late, and yet Holmes sat in his chair, his long fingers steepled before him, lost in quiet contemplation. I had just returned from Scotland Yard, where Lestrade had, rather smugly, confirmed Lady Margaret's transfer to Holloway Prison. The case was officially closed. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. And yet as I removed my coat and settled into my chair, I sensed that Holmes was not entirely at ease. "You are uncharacteristically quiet, Holmes," I remarked, studying his expression. "Most men would relish such a victory." Even Lestrade, for all his bluster, found reason to celebrate. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke from his pipe, his sharp features half obscured by the curling mist. "Victory, Watson? A curious choice of words. Tell me, what victory is there in watching a woman, however guilty, be led away in chains?" I frowned. "She committed murder, Holmes. Would you have had her go free?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Do not mistake my musings for misplaced sympathy. Lady Margaret Wakefield acted with cold deliberation, and the law will see her punished, and yet it was not greed that drove her, nor madness, nor even hatred in the truest sense. It was desperation, the desire to escape a life dictated by others. I leaned forward. "And you disapprove of the law for punishing her?" Holmes shook his head. "The law is a blunt instrument, Watson. It sees only the crime, not the circumstances that breed it. In some ways, Lady Margaret was as much a victim as Lord Wakefield himself. He sought to control her. She sought to escape. Neither succeeded." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "You astonish me, Holmes. I have seen you expose the most hardened of criminals with nothing but sheer logic, yet here you sit, pondering the tragedy of a woman who poisoned her own husband." A faint smile ghosted his lips. "Ah, but you mistake my intent, my dear Watson. I am merely considering the endless complexities of human nature. For all my deductions, for all my so-called brilliance, I shall never truly understand the workings of the human heart." I chuckled. "Perhaps that is for the best. If you did, you might lose the very detachment that makes you such an extraordinary detective." Holmes tapped his pipe against the ashtray, watching the embers fall like dying stars. "Perhaps. But tell me, Watson, have you ever considered what might have happened had I not taken this case?" I frowned. I imagined Lady Margaret might have gone free, or perhaps Scotland Yard would have arrested the wrong man entirely. He nodded. "Precisely. Every action we take, every case we solve, alters the course of lives in ways we cannot always foresee. Justice, for all its virtues, is seldom a clean affair. There are always loose ends, unanswered questions, consequences beyond our control." A silence settled between us. The case had been solved, the culprit apprehended, and yet there was always another case, another mystery waiting to unfold. Holmes stretched and rose to his feet, moving toward the window. Outside, the streets of London were quiet, the gas lamps flickering in the mist. "I suspect Lestrade will summon me again before the week is out," he murmured. "Crime, after all, does not rest simply because we do." I smiled, standing as well. "Then perhaps you should take the opportunity to rest while you can, Holmes. For once let the world turn without your intervention." He turned to me, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Ah, my dear Watson, you should know by now. The world is never quite so interesting without a little intervention." And with that, he turned back toward the city, waiting, always waiting, for the next game to begin. Chapter 19. The unfinished puzzle a week had passed since the arrest of Lady Margaret Wakefield, and though the case had reached its logical conclusion, A certain restlessness had settled over Baker Street. Holmes, ever the relentless mind, had thrown himself into various chemical experiments, seemingly content to trade mysteries of the human soul for the predictable reactions of test tubes and beakers. As for myself, I found my thoughts returning to the case in odd moments. Perhaps it was Holmes's own musings that had unsettled me. That curious notion that justice, though served, was never as precise as a well-executed deduction. It was on a particularly damp evening that my lingering unease found a voice. I had been reading through my notes, preparing to document the case in full, when I noticed a minor detail that had escaped my notice before. It was nothing significant, merely an offhand remark made by the late Lord Wakefield's valet, Mr. Grayson, regarding a letter that had arrived the day before his master's death. "A most peculiar thing, Doctor," he had said when recounting the events. Lord Wakefield read it, turned pale, and locked it away in his desk at once. He seemed troubled by it, though he dismissed my concern. At the time, the remark had seemed inconsequential, overshadowed by the more pressing matter of the poisoned letter Holmes had uncovered. And yet, as I read through my notes, I realized something. We had never found that letter. I looked up to find Holmes watching me over the rim of his teacup, an amused expression tugging at the corners of his lips. "You have the look of a man who has stumbled upon an unresolved thread, Watson." I hesitated. "It may be nothing, Holmes, but the missing letter, the one Lord Wakefield received the day before his death." Holmes nodded slowly, setting his cup down. "Ah, you refer to the letter that troubled him so greatly, the one he locked away." I straightened in my chair. "Exactly. We found the poisoned letter in his study, but not the other one. What if it was the true catalyst of this affair?" Holmes finished for me. His eyes gleamed with renewed interest. A silence stretched between us, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Then, in a single fluid motion, Holmes rose and retrieved his coat from the stand. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "We must pay a visit to Scotland Yard. I do believe Lady Margaret may not have been the only one with secrets to hide." End. Just like that, the game was afoot once more. Chapter 20. The Shadow of Unfinished Business. Holmes and I arrived at Scotland Yard under the dim glow of gas lamps, the damp London air heavy with the scent of rain. Inspector Lestrade, though sceptical of our sudden inquiry, begrudgingly allowed us access to Lady Margaret Wakefield's belongings, which had been confiscated upon her arrest. Holmes, with his characteristic precision, sifted through the effects, his fingers gliding over each item until he halted at a small unmarked envelope, sealed yet aged at the edges. "This, Watson," he murmured, his eyes glinting with intrigue. "Is what we missed," Lestrade scoffed. "Another letter. Haven't we had enough of those in this case?" Holmes gave a knowing smile. "Ah, but this is not just another letter, my dear Lestrade. This may well contain the first tremor of the storm that led to Wakefield's murder." With delicate care, Holmes unsealed the envelope, revealing a single sheet of parchment covered in hurried, uneven script. He scanned the contents, his sharp features betraying a flicker of realization. I leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. "Your past is not forgotten. Payment is due, and silence will not protect you. Midnight at the docks. Come alone." The note was unsigned, yet its intent was chillingly clear. Lestrade's brows furrowed. Blackmail. Holmes nodded. Indeed, and quite possibly the true reason behind Wakefield's death. I exhaled sharply. Then Lady Margaret may not have been the sole conspirator. Holmes finished. This letter suggests an unseen hand, one that may have forced her into a desperate act. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. You're saying there's another player in this wretched affair? Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully. Not just another player, Lestrade. Perhaps the true mastermind. A heavy silence followed. Had we truly solved the case, or merely scratched the surface? Holmes folded the letter with care and slipped it into his coat. Come, Watson. I fear we have one last trail to follow. And so, though the case of the poisoned letter had seemingly reached its end, another mystery loomed in the shadows, one that threatened to upend everything we thought we knew. Chapter 21. The Hidden Hand. The damp night air clung to us as Holmes and I stepped from the hansom cab onto the dimly lit docks. The Thames lapped against the wooden pilings, the water reflecting the glow of scattered lanterns. Somewhere in the fog, the distant creak of a ship's hull and the occasional murmur of sailors hinted at unseen movement. Holmes had scarcely spoken since our discovery of the blackmail letter, but I could tell by the gleam in his eyes that his mind was racing. The implications were clear. Lady Margaret Wakefield may not have been the true architect of the crime. "Holmes," I said, adjusting my coat against the cold, "what do you hope to find here?" The letter only mentioned midnight at the docks. That could have been weeks ago. "Quite so, Watson," Holmes murmured, scanning the shadows. "But criminals are creatures of habit. If this mysterious figure sought payment before, he may do so again. And besides—" He gestured to a faint lantern glow emanating from a narrow alley between two warehouses. "It would appear we are not alone." We approached cautiously, moving past crates and mooring ropes. As we neared, muffled voices reached us, a low, gruff whisper, followed by a tense response. Holmes held up a hand, signalling me to remain silent. We pressed ourselves against the wooden wall of a warehouse, listening. "Did you think this was over?" a voice sneered. "Wakefield's dead, and yet you still haven't delivered." A second voice, shaky but defiant, replied, "I told you, I have nothing left to give. The police are watching me." Holmes's expression sharpened. The speaker was Grayson, the valet of the late Lord Wakefield. I turned to Holmes, whispering, "Grayson, what's he doing here?" Holmes merely nodded toward the scene ahead. Peering around the edge of the warehouse, I caught sight of two figures partially illuminated by the lantern's glow. Grayson stood rigid, his features pale, facing a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a low hat. "You're a fool," the man hissed. "Wakefield paid for his silence with his life. You should pray you don't share his fate." Grayson took a step back, his breath shallow. I didn't." The stranger reached into his coat. Holmes moved in an instant. With a swift motion, he stepped from the shadows, his voice ringing with authority. "I would advise against that, sir." The man froze, startled. Holmes's piercing gaze locked onto him as he slowly withdrew his hand from his coat. revealing a glint of metal. A pistol. Lestrade and 2 officers, whom Holmes had discreetly summoned before our arrival, burst onto the scene, revolvers drawn. "Drop the weapon!" Lestrade barked. With a curse, the man hesitated, then let the pistol clatter to the ground. Grayson, still trembling, turned to Holmes. I didn't know what else to do. He said they'd come after me next." Holmes gave a small nod, his eyes fixed on the captured figure. "Then I suggest you start talking, Grayson, because I do believe the true villain of this tale has finally stepped into the light. The real mastermind was unmasked at last." Chapter 22. The Mastermind. Unmasked, Grayson trembled, his breath coming in shallow gasps as Lestrade's men secured the pistol-wielding man with handcuffs. The metallic clink of the restraints echoed in the fog-laden night. Holmes, arms folded, studied the captured figure with his piercing gaze. "Now then," he said, his voice as cold as the damp air around us, "I believe we have much to discuss." The man lifted his head, revealing a face weathered by years of rough living. A thick beard, narrowed eyes, and a cruel smirk that spoke of dangerous confidence. Lestrade, always eager to take charge, stepped forward. "Name?" The man scoffed but said nothing. Holmes took a step closer, his keen eyes locking onto the man's. "You may call yourself whatever you wish, but I believe the late Lord Wakefield knew you under a different name. Perhaps Mr. Thomas Redfern." Teotihuath, smirk twitched. A flicker of something, recognition, irritation, crossed Redfern's face. "You've got nothing on me," he spat. Holmes turned slightly, addressing Grayson instead. "And you, Mr. Grayson, how long have you been in his debt?" Grayson swallowed hard, his hands shaking. I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "He came to me a week before Lord Wakefield's death. Said he had evidence that could ruin me." Holmes arched a brow. "And what evidence would that be?" Grayson hesitated before whispering, "Forgery. I had been altering Lord Wakefield's financial ledgers to cover my own debts." Lestrade cursed under his breath. "So that's why Wakefield was being blackmailed?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But tell me, Grayson, did you ever actually see Lord Wakefield's reply to this man's demands?" Grayson shook his head. "No, but I assumed he must have refused to pay, and that's why—" Holmes cut him off. "And that, my dear Watson, is where this case took its most fascinating turn." Blinked. "I beg your pardon, Holmes." Holmes gestured toward the prisoner. "Mr. Redfern here would have us believe that Lord Wakefield died because of the blackmail. But that is a deliberate misdirection." Lestrade frowned. "Then why was Wakefield murdered?" Holmes smiled grimly. "Because, Inspector, Lord Wakefield was not the victim of the blackmail scheme. He was the intended scapegoat." A stunned silence followed. Holmes continued, his voice smooth and assured. "Someone arranged for Wakefield's ledgers to be manipulated, ensuring he would appear guilty of fraud if he ever investigated his own accounts. Then an anonymous letter arrived at his doorstep, demanding money for silence. But Wakefield, being an intelligent man, refused to give in to such tactics." Holmes turned back to Redfern. "Tell me, was it you who sent that blackmail letter?" Redfern's jaw clenched. Holmes gave a small chuckle. "I thought not." Lestrade scowled. "Then who did?" Holmes sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed in us all. "The true mastermind is still at large, Inspector." Grayson's face paled further. "You mean someone else was behind all this?" Holmes nodded. "And I do believe I know exactly who." I leaned in. "Who, Holmes?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Why, none other than Lady Margaret Wakefield." Gasps filled the air. Lestrade's brow furrowed. "You mean to tell me Wakefield's own wife framed him?" Holmes nodded. "Consider the facts. Lady Margaret had the most to gain from her husband's downfall. The blackmail letter, I suspect, was nothing more than a ploy to ensure that Wakefield never uncovered the forged accounts. When he refused to pay, the plan had to change. That's when Redfern was brought in." Holmes turned back to Redfern. "You were hired to ensure that Lord Wakefield would meet an untimely demise before he could expose the truth. And I dare say Lady Margaret made it worth your while." Redfern's face darkened, but he remained silent. Lestrade folded his arms. "And what proof do we have of that?" Holmes smiled. "Leave that to me, Inspector. Lady Margaret will soon reveal the truth herself, whether she intends to or not." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "And how do you propose to do that?" Holmes straightened his coat. "Simple. We invite her to Scotland Yard for a little chat, and with that, the game entered its final act." Chapter 23. The Lady's Gambit. The drawing-room of Scotland Yard was dimly lit by a single gas lamp, casting elongated shadows along the mahogany-panelled walls. Inspector Lestrade sat behind his desk, rifling through his notes, while Watson and I stood by the fireplace, waiting for our guest. Moments later, the door creaked open. Lady Margaret Wakefield stepped inside, draped in an elegant morning gown of deep black silk, her face partially obscured by a delicate lace veil. If she was surprised to find me waiting for her, she did not show it, Mr. Holmes, she greeted with cold politeness, her voice smooth as glass. "To what do I owe this summons?" Holmes inclined his head. "Lady Margaret, please, take a seat." She hesitated but complied, settling gracefully into the high-backed chair across from Lestrade. Her gloved hands rested lightly in her lap. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Lady Wakefield, we've been investigating certain irregularities in Lord Wakefield's affairs. We hoped you might provide some insight." She tilted her head, a picture of composed indifference. "My husband's business was never my concern, Inspector. I fear I cannot assist you." Holmes smiled, folding his hands behind his back. "On the contrary, Lady Margaret, I believe you know far more than you let on." Her veil barely fluttered as she exhaled. "I'm afraid I don't follow." Holmes began to pace. "Let us recount the events, shall we? Lord Wakefield's accounts were tampered with, painting him as an embezzler. A blackmail letter arrived, demanding payment. But Wakefield, an honourable man, refused. That refusal set a deadly plan in motion." Lady Margaret sat motionless. "That was when Thomas Redfern entered the scene," Holmes continued, "a criminal of some talent but little imagination. He was not the mastermind. No, he was merely a tool, hired to ensure that Lord Wakefield never lived long enough to uncover the truth." Lestrade straightened. "We've got Redfern in custody. He's not talking, but Holmes believes you paid him off." For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Lady Margaret's otherwise serene expression. "That is an outrageous claim," she said coolly. Holmes stopped pacing, turning to face her. "Is it? I found it curious, Lady Margaret, how quickly you took control of Wakefield's estate after his passing. You ensured his ledgers were destroyed before anyone could examine them. Tell me, was that efficiency or desperation?" She stiffened. "You overstep, Mr. Holmes." "Do I?" Holmes's voice sharpened. "Perhaps I should mention the second blackmail letter." The room fell silent. Lestrade sat forward. "Second letter?" Holmes nodded. "A second letter, Inspector. One that Lady Margaret received after Wakefield's death." Lady Margaret's fingers twitched, betraying the first sign of genuine unease. "After her husband was murdered," Holmes continued, "Lady Margaret should have been free. And yet an anonymous letter arrived demanding payment from her. Why? Because Redfern was not as loyal as she had hoped. He knew her involvement and tried to extort her in turn. Lady Margaret's breath hitched, so slight that only an observer of Holmes's calibre would have noticed. Holmes pressed on. "I dare say you paid him once, didn't you, Lady Margaret? But men like Redfern are never satisfied. And that is when the plan unravelled. Redfern made a fatal mistake. He contacted Grayson. Perhaps he sought an accomplice, or perhaps he feared your silence. Either way, it led him straight into our hands." Lestrade pounded his desk. "So that's why Redfern tried to flee. He knew Holmes was closing in, and he thought Grayson might still be on his side." Lady Margaret's voice was quieter now. "You have no proof of this." Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. "Don't I?" He slid it across the desk. With hesitant fingers, she picked it up, breaking the seal. Her eyes scanned the page, and for the first time her composure cracked. Lestrade peered over her shoulder. "A confession?" Holmes nodded. Redfern was unwilling to speak outright, but he made the grave mistake of keeping a written record of his blackmail demands. An unfortunate habit of greedy men. Lady Margaret's grip tightened on the paper. "This is preposterous." Holmes met her gaze, his voice soft but unyielding. "Surrender now, Lady Margaret, and the courts may look upon your case with some leniency. Continue this performance, and I fear the outcome will be far more severe." The room held its breath. Lady Margaret exhaled slowly. Then, with the poise of a queen facing the gallows, she set the letter down, removed her veil, and whispered, "I suppose I should have known better than to try to outmaneuver you, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade blinked. "So that's it, then. You're admitting it." She smiled faintly. "What else is there to do?" Holmes straightened. "Only one thing remains, Inspector. Have your men escort Lady Margaret to a holding cell. I imagine Scotland Yard will wish to have quite the conversation with her." Lestrade signalled to his officers. The moment Lady Margaret was led away, I let out the breath I had not realised I was holding. "Another case closed, Holmes," I murmured. Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Indeed, Watson. And yet the greatest mysteries are not the crimes we solve, but the motives that drive us to commit them." With that, he turned toward the door, his coat billowing slightly as he strode into the night. The case of the poisoned letter was at last laid to rest. Chapter 24. The Epilogue, a Final Reflection. The fog clung to the cobbled streets of London as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street. The gas lamps flickered weakly against the thick mist, casting shifting shadows upon the pavement. The case of the poisoned letter had reached its inevitable conclusion, and yet I sensed that Holmes was still lost in thought, his brows furrowed in quiet contemplation. We had scarcely entered our sitting room when he strode toward the fireplace, lighting his pipe with a swift flick of the match. The room was warm, the scent of burning tobacco mingling with the faint aroma of old books and ink-stained paper. I removed my overcoat and settled into my usual chair, watching as my friend paced the room. "Holmes, I must say, you were extraordinary. Lady Margaret played her part to perfection, but you saw through her from the beginning." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Not from the beginning, Watson. The truth only became evident once the contradictions arose. Why a man like Redfern would attempt to blackmail the very person who had hired him. The second letter was the key. It betrayed her desperation." I nodded. "Still, I find it astonishing how effortlessly you dismantled her deception. Her composure was remarkable, even in the face of certain exposure." Holmes tapped his pipe against the mantel. "A woman of her intellect and breeding, Watson, would not crumble easily. And yet, the weight of her own machinations proved too great to bear. It is the way of all deceivers. They believe themselves invincible until the moment of their inevitable fall." I leaned forward. "And do you think she will confess fully to the authorities?" Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps not immediately, but given the evidence in Lestrade's possession, she has little choice. The courts will decide her fate." A silence settled between us, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. I found myself reflecting on the events of the past weeks, the intrigue, the twists and turns, the slow unmasking of the truth. Another mystery solved, another criminal unmasked, and yet I could not shake a lingering sense of unease. "Holmes," I said finally, "do you ever wonder about those who escape justice? The ones clever enough to elude even you?" His sharp gaze met mine. "Justice, Watson, is a peculiar thing. The law may not always catch every criminal, but truth has a way of revealing itself in time. No one truly escapes it." I considered his words, nodding slowly. "And what of you, Holmes? What shall you do now?" He smiled faintly, turning toward the window. The lights of London twinkled beyond the fog, the city never truly sleeping. "Perhaps I shall take up the violin for the evening. A more soothing occupation than the unending battle against deception." With that, he retrieved his instrument, drawing the bow lightly across the strings. A haunting, melancholic melody filled the room. A perfect farewell to yet another case solved. I leaned back in my chair, allowing the music to wash over me. The world outside continued its ceaseless turning, mysteries unfolding in the dark corners of London. But for now, here in our little sitting room at 221B Baker Street, there was peace. The case of the poisoned letter was closed, and Sherlock Holmes had, once again, unravelled the threads of deception with unparalleled brilliance. The end.